going to continue in a series I've been doing about being led by God, looking at the life of Samuel, and really about following God in a faith mess world. Following God in a faith mess world. Now, as we get to 1 Samuel chapter 8, there's two interesting things that happen in Samuel's ministry at that time as we look over that chapter of things that are happening. Two big things that happen that we deal with regularly in our lives that Samuel had to deal with in his ministry. And one is, how do I resist temptation? And the other, how do I process being offended? How do I resist temptation on one hand, and on the other hand, how do I resist, or how do I process being offended? So that kind of thing's happening. Anybody here ever faced temptation before? I know none of us have, because we're all like super spiritual saints, but there are toddlers that at times experience temptation. That it's really hard. And there's some videos that are around called the Candy Challenge of how young toddlers handle temptation. So we have two videos. Watch these.
Did you eat all those fruit snacks?
How do I resist temptation? How do I handle being offended? 1 Samuel chapter 8, starting in verse 1. When Samuel became old, he made his sons judges over Israel. The name of his firstborn son was Joel, and the name of his second Abijah. They were judges in Beersheba, yet his sons did not walk in his ways, but turned aside after gain. They took bribes and perverted justice. If I were to step back and just give a side comment here, it would be this. Learn from the past. Do not repeat it. And if we think back to a couple weeks ago when we talked about being led by God, we also looked at the life of Eli and how Samuel was called in a situation where Eli's sons were also doing some very similar things to Samuel's sons. They were choosing to use their power and influence for personal gain. And so a little bit of history is being repeated here with Samuel's sons. So we need to really make sure we're learning from the past, not repeating it. It's unfortunate that Samuel didn't take care of things with his own boys because they repeated the same thing that got Eli in trouble. Also, it's really important that we invest in the next generation. Samuel, it appears, was not doing his best to invest in the next generation of those that were following him. And we need to make sure that we're doing everything we can to invest in the next generation so we can help them launch and go further faster than we ever went. Continuing verse 4. Then all the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah and said to him, "Behold, you are old, and your sons do not walk in your ways. Now appoint for us a king to judge us like all the nations." Here we have the people, and they're approaching Samuel, and they're like, okay, we've had this structure in place for a very long time of how leadership should look, but we want to make some changes now in our nation because it doesn't look like the transition's going to go very well. Now, Samuel did something different than had really happened in the past. If you look at the book of Judges, most of the leaders that were there tended to be regional leaders. They were God would raise up a leader that was necessary in a certain area. Samuel, however, stepped up and he had national prominence. And so because he had national prominence, there was greater expectations of what the next round of leaders should look like by all the people. So they come up and they're like, hey, we want a new king. We want a king. We want somebody to be in charge. Now they're going against something that had happened because years earlier, God had established a covenantal fence for the people to provide for them and to protect them. Covenant. And so God makes this agreement with them, very similar in nature to the covenant that a man and a woman make when they get married. It's an agreement together. In the case of God, in a husband and wife, it's an agreement between equals. In the case of between people and God, or the Israelites and God, it's an agreement between unequals. God is more powerful than the people, but he makes an agreement with them. And so in this covenant, there's these promises that, hey, if you follow me, if you serve me, if you walk closely with me, then I will be with you and I will bless you. And if you choose to turn from me, if you choose to break the rules of the agreement, if you choose to go around them, then I will turn my face against you and things will not go well for you. God's basically saying, love and obey me and I'll bless you and give you purpose. Turn away from me and things will go badly for you. Now, I don't know about you, but I found that in my marriage with my wife, things would go really badly if I started dating other people. She would not like that. That would be something bad in the relationship. Or, I don't know about you, but if you have a job, your employer, your boss, would not like it if you started doing work for the competition. He would fire you. You would be breaking that agreement, that covenant that you have with your employer. Things would not go well for you. Now, fences have a purpose. On one hand, there's privacy. So for this fence, it would be a privacy fence. You can just say, what's behind this fence is mine. It's my space. It's my area. Now, when we lived in El Paso, we can put that picture up in the list. When we lived in El Paso, everywhere, it was very rare when we lived in El Paso to not have a yard with a fence in the backyard. And our yard had a rock wall around the entire backyard. And so it was great privacy. And my best part, if you look off in the distance behind the basketball pole and there's those tall trees there, that's where the other fence was, the other wall. And our last couple months that we lived there, my boys figured out a way to scale the wall. And if they scaled the wall, reaching right over was a plum tree from the neighbors. And one year they had a bountiful crop of plums. Best tasting plums I've ever had, as my children scaled the wall, picked plums, brought them back in, and we ate them. Now, before you think we're stealing, the reality is the house was empty next to us because it was up on the market, so nobody was eating the plums, so we just took them. It all started because a branch was hanging over the fence. The kids figured, hey, it's on our side of the fence, we're having it. But they loved that. When we lived in O'Fallon, we had a chain link fence that went around our yard. And my son Nolan, put that picture up. My son Nolan at the time loved ropes. Now, I couldn't find a picture with a rope, but here he is out in the backyard doing a little bit of hunting. And you'll notice there's a rope tied around the tree, and right behind him there's a board on that rope, and he would use that. He created a deer stand, tree stand, where he would stand in the fence and he was hunting deer. But right here, I don't know what he's doing. He's got a lawn chair sitting on his four-wheeler. He's just living the dream. But he would take, at times, that chain link fence, he would take ropes and take them from one fence to the other and tie a whole web of ropes in the backyard. It was so cute to watch him until I had to go mow the lawn. And then you're like cutting down ropes and doing everything else. But fences are for privacy. We like the privacy. Fences also are for our protection. Either from danger on the outside, not getting in, or to keep what's on the inside from getting out. Next time you go to the zoo, walk near where all the tigers and the lions are. Aren't you thankful for the fence that's there? Because it would be really freaky if you're standing there and all of a sudden the lion comes up and walks up to you and starts nuzzling up against your leg. That would make you nervous, wouldn't it? Or at least it would me. I don't know about you. You guys are probably tougher than I am. But here it is. God established for them a covenantal fence. A boundary. Something to provide for them, something to protect them, something to be for them, and everything. There was a study a few years ago I read about that fences are so important that if they have a playground without a fence, that all the kids tended to go up into the middle of the playground and not use the whole playground. They would all cluster together. And then if there was a playground with a fence, the kids would just spread out because the fence gave them limits of where they could go. Fences are a good thing. So God establishes this fence for them, a covenantal fence. Now, the people, though, disregarded the fence. And you see that as being a common problem for the Israelite people. They didn't like the fence. Part of it was, hey, the people that live on the other side of this fence, we like what's going on over there. We like kind of sneaking over around to the other side of the fence. We like their religious practices also. Now at the time, the Philistines were their neighbors, and the Philistines were pagans that had two gods that they served, Ashtoreth and Baal, the male and female god and goddess of fertility and war. And so for them, it was like, hey, we kind of like taking a little mix of what they believe and what they practice and mixing it in with what we serve. We like that. We want that. So they would kind of religiously cross the fence a little bit and take part in what was on the other side. Or sometimes they would disregard the fence because they're just into the culture. They want what everybody else has. They're like, hey, all the other people on the other side of this fence, they have a king. We don't have a king. Now, they were forgetting that they did have a king, that God's intent was for him to be their king and for them to be his people, for them to follow him as king. But to them, they're like, hey, on the other side of the fence, they have a guy. They have a guy we can see, a guy we can talk to, somebody that we can be around. We want what they have. So they wanted to be like their neighbors. Give us a king. Because their thought was, hey, the grass is greener on the other side. It's better over there. I have to have what they have. I want that. Any of you have ever been there before? Because that really becomes the root of temptation. I want what's on the other side of that fence. I have to have it. And that's why it's fun watching those little videos of the kids where they're devouring the candy. They're and it's so good. You ever been that way? Your spouse makes a plate of cookies at home. Now my wife makes the best chocolate chip cookies ever. And many of you have probably had them before. They are the very best. And when they come out of the oven, they are amazing. Now, we're never allowed to touch them when they come out of the oven, but they are amazing. So, as you strategize, okay, she's baking the cookies. How can I get one of those cookies? So what do? You wait until her back is turned. Then you're like, grab the cookie, sneak away, get out of her eyesight, have a cookie. Been there?
Yes.
Because we're tempted. So how do we how do we resist temptation? I mean, it's as old as time, the dealing with temptation. I mean, in the very Garden of Eden for Adam and Eve, Satan comes up in the form of a serpent. He just goes to Eve. Did God really say you can't eat of any tree? Did God really say that? Did God really say you couldn't go around to the other side of the fence? Did God really say that? Temptation. Temptation. When Allie Grace was little, Leah Beth and I would go to this store that Leah Beth loves. Allie Grace would call it Yabby Wabby. For those that need an interpretation, that's Hobby Lobby. And we would put Allie Grace in a shopping cart at Yabby Wabby, and we would go walking around. But one of the things that was a requirement of every time she got in the shopping cart is at the front of the store at the time, they had a whole bunch of stuffed animals. And so Allie Grace at Yabby Wabby would load up her shopping cart with stuffed animals to where she was buried in them. And anytime we were walking around the store, if she saw another stuffed animal, it was like, I want it, must have it, I gotta have it, it's gotta be in the cart. I just want it. Ever been that way? You're just like, I want something, I have to have it, I need it. I mean, with temptation, it just basically says to us, I want what they have, I'm missing out, it's better over there, my life is boring compared to theirs, they have a better life, I don't like being different, I'd rather blend in than stick out. I want to be like everyone else. I want to fit in. I don't want to be different. I want to do what they do. And that's what the Israelites are doing at this point. They're like, the grass is greener over there. What they have is better than what we have. We want to be like them. They're facing temptation head on. I want to be on the other side of the fence. You ever think about, though, we always think that the grass is greener on the other side, but we never take into account what it took for the grass to be so green on that side. We just think, hey, if I go around to that fence, suddenly my life will be all better, not realizing what it took for that person to get to that place. And we don't want to go through what they went through to get to that place. We just want to have what they have. That's just the nature of temptation. I want to possess what you have. If I have to take it, I will. I want that. But if we'll be honest, we're always our own worst enemy. If we'll be honest, we have a great ability to talk ourselves into anything that we want. Maybe you're different than me. I find that I'm that way. James chapter 1, verse 14 in the Message says this: "The temptation to give in to evil comes from us and only us. We have no one to blame but the leering, seducing flare-up of our own lust. Lust gets pregnant and has a baby, sin. Sin grows up to adulthood and becomes a real killer. I want it. I might even know what the consequences are of having it, of going for it, but I want it, so I talk myself into it and I jump the fence to get it. I go over the barrier to get it." So how do I resist temptation? How do I resist temptation? How do I stop talking myself into sin? How do I stop talking myself into stupid decisions? How do I stop talking myself into self-destructing? How? A couple thoughts real quick. One, self-control. Be in control of what I do. Two, stay away from it. Stay away. It's a lot harder to be tempted if, when Leah-Beth makes her cookies, if I stay in the kitchen where the smell is the most intense, where the sight of them is most intense, and where I can grab them the easiest, it's easier to be tempted. If I go out into the garage and get around the smells of a garage and get at the things in there and I'm away from it, it's a lot harder to get into temptation because it's out of sight, out of mind. I stay away. I have accountability, help. Somebody's there to help me, to be with me. A great thing to do is I just want to be near God. I just want to be close to Him. I'm going to be in fellowship with Him. The thing that I hate about the Israelites is like, hey, we're willing to abandon fellowship with God to be like everybody else. And that's scary. But a lot of times we'll talk ourselves into that. We're like, I'd rather have that. I don't care if it costs me my relationship with God. I will walk away. And so, be near God. Get close to Him. Saturate yourself with His Word. Worship. Prayer. Be near God. And then just obey. Do what's right. Do what's right. So that's happening as the people are dealing with temptation. They want to be on the other side of the wall. They want to have what they have. So they're dealing with that. And then on the flip side, you have Samuel dealing with how's he going to handle, how's he going to process being offended. Anybody here ever been offended before? Anybody here ever have somebody that just hurts you, makes you mad, you're ready just to take care of them in a not so kind way because they've really hurt you? How do we handle being offended? So back at chapter 8, verse 6, it says this: "But the thing displeased Samuel when they said, 'Give us a king to judge us.' And Samuel prayed to the Lord." Now, if we'll notice something that's happening here, there's two approaches that are taking place. You have a group of elders that get together and they're like, we see a lot of problems that are happening, and they apply human wisdom to the situation. Our solution to all the problems that we have, replacing Samuel because he's getting old, so we need to have an heir apparent. We're having the Philistines that are causing all kinds of problems. We need to deal with that. We need some kind of national army to protect us as a whole. So they're like, we got to come up with a solution. So their solution is to apply human wisdom to the situation. There's nothing wrong with that, but they apply that to the situation. But I like Samuel's response is Samuel doesn't just stop at human wisdom. He goes to God in prayer. He's like, I'm going to talk to the source of wisdom. I'm going to pray. So Samuel prays. Verse 7. And the Lord said to Samuel, obey the voice of the people in all that they say to you, for they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me from being king over them. According to all the deeds that they have done from the day I brought them up out of Egypt, even to this day, forsaking me and serving other gods, so they are also doing to you. Now then, obey their voice. Only you shall solemnly warn them and show them the ways of the king who shall reign over them. Now, Samuel's frustrated because the people are like, we're going to abandon God to have our own king. And that frustrates him. Also, if you look at what's happening there, they're basically saying, Samuel, you're old. We don't want you anymore. So they're rejecting his leadership. Samuel, your kids, your boys, your plan is a failure. Your boys are bums, and your plan to have them replace you is a horrible plan. We don't like that plan. We want to do something different. So there's a lot of room there to be offended. There's a lot of room for him to be aggravated, to be hurt, to be frustrated. They're going against God's plan. Give us a human king to rule. We don't want God to rule anymore. Their ongoing plan, a pattern of turning against God, that could offend him. Their rejection of his leadership, their rejection of his son, their willingness to mimic the surrounding godless culture. A lot of place there for Samuel just to be offended. But he does something. He refuses to personalize the offense. He refuses to take it personally. And so he responds with prayer and obedience. Instead of, I'm going to make them pay. I'm going to make them suffer. I'm going to get back at them. I'm going to rip one of these boards off and spank their bottoms with it and make them know who's boss. He doesn't do any of that. But he responds with prayer and obedience. So much so that he's not vengeful or haughty at their decision. In fact, he even turns around and supports their decision and becomes a kingmaker. They've rejected him as leader, and yet he turns around and makes the next two kings and establishes them. So how do I process offense? How do I process offense? Now, our culture encourages being and staying offended. Our culture encourages it. Be offended. Never forgive unless they conform. If you want something, climb the fence and get it, because if you want it, it's yours. Don't worry about any limits. Don't worry about anything that's established there. Don't worry about any fences. If you want it, go for it. Our culture encourages it. Our political system is offended all the time with each other. All the time. They're just like hate each other. Everything we're around encourages being offended. But how do we, as Christ followers, living in a faith mess world, how do we follow God well and process offense well? Now, one of the things we have to remember is an unresolved offense will leave a relational barrier. Unresolved will leave a barrier. And we tend to have a spidey sense about it when we know, hey, there's a problem. We can sometimes feel the fence that goes up when we know somebody's offended, but we don't exactly know why. Because a lot of times a barrier goes up and we can't quite tell. Usually we're more sensitive to this, the people we're closer to. We're like, wow, there's a wall there now. I don't understand why there's a wall there now, but we know there's a wall there now. And then we have a choice. Am I going to find out why there's a wall there, or I'm just going to ignore that there's a barrier there? But anytime there's an unresolved offense, it leaves a barrier. One person's on one side, the other person's on the other, and the fence is right there keeping us separated. And then it limits our life. Because the barrier's in the way. It has spiritual ramifications. Because of the barrier, it makes it harder for both people to really seek after and know God. It keeps this hesitancy there. There's a problem. When we lived in O'Fallon, we had some neighbors, and we thought it was really weird because the houses next to us, neither of them had a fence around their yard, except there was a privacy fence just like this, separating their backyards. No fences the rest of the yard, just a privacy fence like this. And finally, one time we asked the neighbor, we're like, why do you have that fence there and the rest of your yard's not fenced in and the rest of your neighbor yard's not fenced in? And he looks at us and he goes, we got in a fight. And we don't want to look at each other. So we put up a fence. And so for decades, they had a fence separating their backyards from each other. Instead of resolving the situation, they're just like, I'm not going to look at you. I'm not going to talk to you. They were bitter for each other the remainder of the time they both lived in the house, not wanting to do anything. When I have this fence here, I'm just saying, I refuse to love, I refuse to trust, I refuse to forgive. I'm keeping a wall there. But on the flip side, we turn around and we say to God, hey God, but you forgive me, you love me, you accept me. I'm not going to love and accept the person on the other side of this fence, but you love and accept me. Spiritual ramifications of that. So how do I process offense? One, choose what I allow to offend me. And don't be easily offended. Choose what I allow to offend me. For Samuel, there was a lot that he could have taken personally, but he chose to not allow it to offend him. Choose wisely what offends you. Believe the very best. Don't assume motive. A lot of times when somebody offends us, we automatically assume the worst. We're very good at that. I don't like them, and I believe that they did this. We believe the very worst in the situation. Believe the best. Sometimes something deeper might be going on that you're not aware of. For Samuel, he could have personalized it, but he didn't because there was a deeper spiritual process going on that he didn't quite grasp, but God saw. God's like, hey, they're in a pattern of rejecting me all the time. And this is happening again. They're turning their backs on me. So sometimes we need to look for, hey, what's going on? I'm going to get a little bit deeper. Then we need to forgive and forget quickly. Samuel didn't carry all this with him. So much so that he was able to forgive and move on quick enough that he could be a kingmaker. He's rejected, and then he turns around and he goes establishes Saul as the next king. So forgive and forget quickly so that the fence goes away. If I keep bringing it up in my mind, the fence stays. If I forgive and forget, I can remove the fence. It's no longer an issue. I can get rid of the barrier because I've let it go. And then I need to respond wisely to an offense. I don't want to escalate the offense. Samuel could have made things even worse depending on how he responded to them, but he chose, hey, before I say a word to your accusations, before I say a word to your request, before I do anything, I'm going to step aside and I'm going to pray, and then when I hear from God, I'll come back and I'll talk to you about it. I need to make sure I respond wisely to the offense. Just because I think it, just because I feel it, just because I want you to know what I think and what I feel is not necessarily an excuse to say it. But a lot of times we're like, you've hurt me, so I'm going to let you know how you've hurt me. I'm going to let you know what I'm thinking. I'm going to let you know how mad I am. And a lot of times we do it when we have the car keys and we're driving in a car. Because a lot of times we feel safer communicating how we feel when somebody cuts us off. We let them know with a horn blast. Sometimes we let them know with very animated expressions or grumbling in the car to let them know. Or sometimes you've been the one that's actually cut somebody off and you've watched that all happening in the mirror to the person in there that's like that. Isn't that fun to watch though? But just because I'm thinking it, just because I'm feeling it, doesn't mean I should say it. I need to respond wisely so that I don't escalate the situation. And then I just need to choose love. I need to cover everything in love. And that's hard to do. Because when we're offended, the last thing we want to do is respond with love. But I need to do what I can to saturate the situation with love. How Samuel was able to do that, I don't know. How he was able to continue on and give his very best to the people even though he had been deeply hurt, I don't know. But he chose to love them and do his very best even in the face of that. So even when I face being offended, even when my desire is to get even, to get back, to make them pay, I choose to respond with love. I will love you. Even though you don't necessarily deserve it, I choose to love. Because isn't that the same reaction Jesus gives to us? That even though we don't deserve it, he loves us.